So it sort of really pushed me out of my shell. And I don't know. And now my work, I feel like now my work, I keep trying to like challenge myself to push that further and further. So a lot of my newer work is like, you know, asking people to do something that might not be like something they plan to do that day or something like that. And where I'm like challenging myself to see if I can make that happen and make it comfortable and make it work.
That's really cool. So, I mean, the theme of this exhibition is really quite profound for all of you, has a very personal significance. Elizabeth, let's start with you about walking through a little bit of that process and how that evolved for you. You know, each of the artists included in this exhibition confront identity in some way, you know, as we just talked about. The images in your series examine family folklore, ritual, and objects passed down through generations of women, which is really appropriate for the month that we're in, and International Women's Day, which just passed. How did you select the objects and the articles of clothing that you photographed? What was the significance of those choices?
That is a great question. And it's got both like a comical, it's got like the unprofessional side of the answer and the professional answer. And I'll just give you both. Because we're just on the internet, right? It won't come back in.
Right. This won't go far.
Right, exactly. So I have to say, like, I come from a family of storytellers and collectors. Like, we are archivists. The women in my family have archived their husbands, fathers, children, sisters, wives, like everybody. So it's not only it's a practice that is passed down through the women in my generation, and so along with those kind of stories and the notation of things like birth, death, illness, and recovery, which really are at the crux of my work. Like my long-term, if I look at the kind of like long-term stories that I focus on, it's really those four elements that I am the most interested in. Because I think they help us understand how we know our bodies and also how we know our kinship networks and identify. Like once we develop a personal identity within that familial context, it really lives outside in the world. It lives not only as we walk around as individuals, but it lives in the doctor's office when we recall the histories of our parents and our grandparents and our aunts and uncles. So I am the recipient of many of these objects and many of these stories. And my husband is always teasing me because we basically, my sister and my mother and I have like rotating garbage bags that just go from house to house. And they include really sentimental objects like baptism gowns and, you know, like really pristine things that have been cared for and that are not actually in the garbage bag, but handled a little bit more carefully. And then they also include things like undershirts and old bras and slips and things like that. And this all really actually began with 6 undershirts that I had kept that were my grandmother's. And I became really fascinated by what these objects communicated, these kind of 6 undershirts that were clearly critical during different stages of her life. So some were from when she was really young, and then some were from her middle age. And then the last one that I have from her was clearly, she lived in our home during the last 3 years of her life, right before she passed away. And you could see the kind of the shift in the body, even though the body wasn't present, you could see the shift in material. But also it revealed so many intimate details about her body, including like small tears and rips and stains, which I had a really hard time letting go of. And so these objects, there are so many of them, and there's more. I think my whole, behind my computer is like walls of mundane objects that I've collected from now. I have 2 daughters who are 3 and 6, who you might hear in the background, and I apologize if you do. And so they have these objects that I selected in particular to photograph. They're often about a cross-generational conversation. So they might be from my own childhood. Like I have one, there's one that's an image of a pair of shorts, and those were hand sewn by my grandmother for myself. But when I held them, you know, I really thought about my own daughter and her knees being exposed, and my own knees being exposed, and the kind of patterns of stories. So not just like specific incidents, but I thought about the expectation to be a female and to be a woman and to be dainty and not to get hurt and be active and aggressive, which I was, both of those things. And now I see that, you know, like relived in my daughter's knees, which are completely torn to shreds. And so like, that's what that piece embodies. And so there are, you know, different kind of memories, whether they're stories that have been passed down or stories that reach forward, or some pieces are, you know, collected conversations between me and other women or men who have shared stories about their bodies. So it's really, it's a relationship between like the tactile experience of going through these clothes. I tend to choose them because they recall in my own mind a memory, or reveal something to me as I look at them very carefully and kind of sift through them.
That's fascinating. And, you know, if for those of the people that are on the webinar who have seen the images, I'd love to learn more about how you process them and how you capture them in the way that they're presented to us, because there is a daintiness to them, like as you said, a delicacy to them, but also a darkness to them. You know, talk a little bit about how you capture and process them and the significance of that style.
Sure, absolutely. You know, I started making this work in the darkroom because that is really like a home space for me, as I shared with my identity question. It's really a comfort zone. And so the first piece I made was in the darkroom, and then I pretty quickly became pregnant with my second daughter. And so I couldn't really comfortably be around the chemicals to the extent, like I wanted to really spend time with this work. And so I started making them on light boxes, and it actually worked really well because I was able to achieve significant detail that was lost. You know, there's like this beauty in photograms where you lose control of the object and the outcome, which is really lovely. But it was also really lovely to have control and to be able to bring out those details because they were, and kind of magnify them. It was really important to me. That those things that we consider imperfections, especially like stains and tears, be visible and be available to the viewer, because really it's I'm interested in this idea, the idea of residue. And so even if the body is long gone, whether it's a lot, you know, I mean, some of those pieces I wore, but my body is gone in that shape and form, right? It's transformed. But so I'm really interested in that idea of residue, and how can we see the residue that our bodies leave behind and control that narrative and interact with it in a loving way, as opposed to, you know, the kind of medicalized ways in which we tend to view our body in our North American Western culture. The kind of details and intimacies of our bodies are hidden, which also often revolves around caregiving. So people who are caregivers tend to deal with all of those bodily fluids, whether they're tears or secretions, you know, like things that we're not supposed to talk about in public. And so how could, you know, my question is always, how can I use beauty to bring people into the ways in which those things are actually intimate, as opposed to kind of gross or repellent?
Fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing that. These art talks help you see something that, like, for me, I see almost every day, you know, when I'm in the office in a different way, and just adds so much more meaning to them. So thank you for sharing that. Katie, I'd like to move on to you next. Your pieces are so colorful, nostalgic, and fun. Like when you look at them close up, you can identify those objects that you might remember from a certain time in your life that just brings back, you know, those different memories. How do you select the objects that you work with? Do you have a little collection like Elizabeth does that we can't see?
I was considering, yeah, showing you my studio. But yeah, the collection, like Liz's, is not small. It's kind of a disaster. But I've been collecting like plastics and kind of like found objects for probably like 10 years. Actually started like thrifting and collecting little things when I still lived in my childhood home, like with my parents. And then when I started incorporating them into my art, I started specifically collecting things that I could use as art materials instead of like traditional art materials. So it kind of started with like just things that I had available, like whatever was in my apartment, and then I would make art from that. But now I choose things that are really highly saturated in color. And they need to have like a pleasing, like physical texture. That makes sense. There's like a lot of different types of plastic. And so I really have to like feel the piece and like see, you know, if I like the way it feels, and I can kind of tell like if I can manipulate it. But also a lot of my work is meant to be worn or at least displayed on the body. So I also have to consider weight, touch again, and like comfort levels. And so I found that a lot of objects that I'm drawn to that fit all of those categories for me are vintage kitchen utensils, or toys, or vintage toys. And now I'm getting into like one-use plastic packaging. But going back to the kitchen utensils, I've really been drawn to like measuring spoons recently. And I really think that that brings up the connection, baking and being in the kitchen. I know that I have memories of baking with my mother and grandmother when I was younger. I know a lot of people have that kind of like kitchen connection. And so yeah, that kind of goes back to when I first started making work. I did focus on items that were only made in like the 60s and the 70s, which kind of had the relation to my parents and my grandparents. And I was kind of focusing on that part of my identity. My parents and my grandparents are like, we're all like thrifters, you know, you kind of kept things and like reused a bunch of stuff. And so I was kind of taking that and using that in my own work. And so a lot of my work was made specifically with like vintage items. And when I would show that work, a certain audience would see, like you said, and you could recognize some of the pieces and you could like say, oh, I know what that is. Or like my, you know, grandma used to have that, you know, or it used to be in my kitchen or something. And so that's how I could connect with my audience, was through that. But then I had a show at a school, and one of the students said that they were really inspired by the color, and those colors actually reminded them of Alice in Wonderland, the cartoon. And that was like her favorite movie as a kid. And that really brought up the feeling of youth and like nostalgia for her. And that was completely separate from like the objects, you know, like the vintage or like mid-century thing that I was, you know, going for originally. And so now I'm focusing more on that, like how to get a connection across through the sense of like discovery and like play, and kind of like these little shared memories that we might have no matter like how old we are. So yeah.
And your objects are so unique because many of them are wearable. What is the process that you go through to actually make them? How does that all connect together for you? Literally.
Right. So I get this question a lot, which is funny because like when I look at them, they seem like almost too obvious, and I'm like constantly trying to like hide the way that they were made. But first, compositionally, they're constructed like a collage. So basically, I start with a lot of different pieces, different colors, and they're just kind of like laid out all over the table. And through like photographing them, I just like work on every kind of different composition I can find, and I edit them down over like at least a week for each piece, and finally decide what it should look like and what its function should be. And then the actual composition is kind of determined by the fabrication. And so the fabrication is all cold connected, which basically means that I don't use any glue or any heat. So I don't melt the plastic and I don't glue the plastic together. I've spent a long time, I've spent like years trying to figure out how to connect plastic in like a permanent way. And I've tried like every glue possible, and glue is not my friend. And so I've just decided not to use it. So yeah, so my pieces are connected with rivets, thread. Some of them are like friction fit together. Basically any kind of connection that is very strong, but actually could also be undone. So you can actually like take all of my pieces apart without destroying any of the plastic. So I like to relate it to like building with Legos or even like sewing clothing. Like they're really strong connections, but they could also be like taken apart. And I use that a lot in my studio. Like if I have a piece that sits around for like a couple of years, I'll just take it apart, and then I have, you know, extra materials. And so I kind of use that as another way to like recycle and reuse. Yeah.
That's so cool. And you know, what's so interesting is we plan our exhibitions more than a year in advance. And it is amazing to me how resonant the topics that we're discussing and that inspire your artwork, how resonant these issues are right now in terms of, you know, just the kitchen has become so much more important over this past year for people. It's a place where people are really rediscovering joy and being able to connect in a time where it's very difficult to do so. And Elizabeth, you know, with your work, you know, who of us hasn't struggled with those rips and tears in our lives that are becoming all the more apparent right now, and helping us to really reflect on what's important. You know, Eli, you're up next. I'd like to ask you to unmute. Thank you. You know, you're another photographer here in the exhibition, and your pieces are very different from the other two artists featured here, but they meld so well together and create a beautiful combination in our exhibition. You know, your models, you know, even though you work with people, your models often share the same objects in a series. So for example, the same coat was shared by many models in one of your Black Coat series works. Can you describe the significance of the objects you choose and how you select them?
Yeah, I don't know, it's been interesting hearing Katie and Elizabeth talk, because I feel like for mine, the object doesn't matter. So it's kind of an interesting show. It's like 3 different ways to look at objects within the pieces, but with my work, usually the object doesn't matter. It's usually more finding an object for people to interact with, and the interaction is what I'm looking for. So like with the coat, I think it was 72 people. And so I felt like what happened is you get 72 people in, you get them to sort of in the moment interact with that object. And then the interesting part comes from like how the different people interact with it, what the similarities are, and sort of going through that. So I've just sort of started incorporating that and trying to find those like commonalities and differences in people, because, you know, even with that one, like I started out with the first like 5 people, and I started hitting this point where I'm like, is this all just going to be the same? But I think pretty much every person had something different, some different way to bring something to that coat. And so,
do you find that creating that same object creates a sense of comfort among the models in terms of you know, allowing them to be themselves, but having something to interact with, if you will?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was a spectrum of, some people came in, they're like, I have no idea what to do with this. And then other people had like ideas planned out and they had like thought it through. So I think, you know, that's like every time I do a series, I try to do these long series. So I mean, for me, I don't know about for the viewer, but for me, the interesting part is like seeing the whole series and sort of what narratives go through it.
What has most surprised you about how those series have unfolded?
I guess just how much people have sort of latched onto the ideas and wanted to be part of them. And I've tried the last couple to do series that are really open to anybody. They're not like, you know, like a certain type of artist or a certain type of dancer or things like that. They're like kind of anybody could do it, and or anybody could be in the photos. And I've really liked that because you can kind of start to see like a big spectrum of humanity, I guess, and personalities, and like just all of that stuff. I find a lot of interest in it.
Do you also find that even though you're photographing individuals and each one has their own special way that they're using or demonstrating a specific object, do you find that common themes might emerge or some type of shared significance when you look at the whole?
Sorry, Kim, mine froze up for a second.
Oh, no worries. I was just asking, even though you're photographing individuals and they all might use the object or the theme in a different way, when you look at the finished product holistically, do you find that maybe a common theme or a shared experience emerges for you or for them or for the viewer?
Yeah, I think so. I think for the coat project especially, there was almost like chapters to it of, you know, some people see a coat and they think of something to hide under and to kind of cover up with. Some people used it more like a prop. A lot of the dancers kind of found interesting ways to manipulate it. And there was definitely like sections of that where you could kind of pair them together and find it.
And your latest project is Skin. So you're using a prop, but it's not really a prop. it's
yeah.
Something we all have. How has the experience with that differed from actually using a physical object?
It was interesting. I thought it'd be a good juxtaposition to the coat project because coats are kind of cover-ups. So I thought after that I need to like find some challenge. So 60 people for that one, which every time I do one of these projects, it's like I'm gonna do like 15 people, and then it turns into like 100. So yeah, that one was interesting because I have no background in doing nude photography, and I had maybe done one shoot before that, maybe one or two. So I think it was an interesting beginning because I was like learning to be comfortable with it as well. And I had a lot of people who are not models, who are not, you know, had never been in front of the camera. So that was my next challenge with my, you know, what I was saying before about trying to challenge myself. Like it was another level of that. Like, how do I get these people to be comfortable and understand what I'm going for and understand that it's going to be like a, you know, project that matters and things like that.
Great, thank you. I'm going to ask a question to all of the panelists now, and then we'll start taking Q&A. So if you do have questions for our artists, please start to type them in the chat, and we'll do our best to get to as many of those before 7 o'clock as we can. So for all of you, sort of circling back and putting a bow on this, if you will, why is it important for artists to address the issue of identity, particularly at this point of time? What aspects of it are most relevant right now? Any of you, just feel free to go ahead and chime in.
Well, I can jump in.
Go for it.
I feel passionately about this, so I'm happy to start. I feel like, you know, and this is what I say to my students, every time you tell your story and you define your own identity, you're interrupting a normative narrative. And it is a critical interruption. And if you don't do it, you end up, your identity so easily is defined by others and by a normative culture that would prefer not to see you. You know, would prefer not to see individuality. And, you know, I just don't think that there's ever been such a critical time as now to interrupt our normative, patriarchal, white supremacist, you know, normative stories that are happening. And so wherever you fall in that spectrum, whatever identity you embody, it's just so critical that we hear those voices, and doing so through artwork has such a pathway to empathy. You know, as Katie talked about, the kind of critical aspects of empathy. That's what artwork has to offer, I think, in such beautiful ways. So yes, I just feel so grateful to have this opportunity to interrupt those normative narratives with my own, and I encourage everybody to do so.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm gonna kind of mirror that. Totally agree with you, Liz. And I think I see a lot of like the importance of identity in the classroom. Like I started kind of this whole journey with creating self-portraits in undergrad. And I think the reason I was interested in that was because like I saw my peers making work about like bigger issues, and I wanted to make work about bigger things, but I didn't feel like connected to it. And so then I was like, well, I'll do, you know, I had a self-portrait project and I kept doing more of them kind of as independent work. And I realized like I was figuring out things about myself, and eventually I found that I did have these connections to these issues. And that kind of helped shape my identity even more. And so even though it can be a bit daunting, and I see that in my students too, it's like they have the passion for this stuff, like what's going on right now, but you know, they don't feel like they may have a specific voice in it. But once they start realizing how they can depict like characteristics of themselves or what they're interested in, or maybe, yeah, like how they label themselves, then they can find like an avenue to actually talk about some of these things. So yeah, I see it as a really important thing in the classroom too, yeah.
Eli, any thoughts from you on that?
I was trying to put a thought together. I mean, I deal with identity all the time in my work, like constantly. I'm just not sure how to translate it, but I know I had a lot of interesting interactions with doing, you know, real bodies for the nude project for Skin, where, you know, you're taking away a lot of sort of outward identity. So they didn't have clothing to rely on, or, you know, jewelry, things like that to like, so I don't know, it was interesting to see people kind of come to terms with that, and also to see people viewing the book kind of finding similarity in people and finding comfort in that. So I think there's probably a better answer in there that I'm not quite finding.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like you're stripping away maybe part of their identity and sort of getting to the core.
Yeah.
Perhaps.
Yeah.
That's just really interesting, you know, how you framed that. That there's just so many, it's amazing, you know, like I said before, looking at this work and being able to get so much more richness out of it by understanding how you all created it and why. I actually do have a question here for Katie from Deanna. Katie, do you feel that your work is easily approached by a female audience, or how does a male audience respond to your pieces?
Well, I think I've had a good reaction, you know, with everyone who's seen it. I wouldn't say that I can really differentiate between genders. I will say that my dad is a really big fan, and I'm sure part of that is because he's my dad, but I think a lot of it is, I think some of the memories, you know, like that come up with it, but I do think a different part of it is the audience who can see making something from something that's not traditionally like an art material. And so it's like seeing something in a different context, I think kind of reaches different people. So yeah, I wouldn't say, I'm assuming that's because maybe like the colors or maybe the kitchen utensils and things, but hopefully we're getting away from those kind of associations. You know, my partner does all the cooking and I don't like being in the kitchen. So, you know, those kind of things probably will start to fade away, and, you know, we'll just kind of react to things as humans and people, and won't have those kind of things attached to them.
Great, thank you. Donna asked me if there's any way for me to show some examples of the work that we've been talking about. And I told her, and I'll tell everybody who's listening to this live right now, I am deathly afraid that I will mess something up if I try to share a screen and try to pull up those images from our website. So I want to keep this moving forward. I would suggest, if anyone is interested in seeing the pieces, of course, to please come to GCCA and see the exhibition, which is up now through March 26th. We have open gallery hours every Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday from 1 to 4. I would also love to ask the artists themselves what they think of the exhibition and the combination of their pieces together. Was that surprising to you?
I thought it was, yeah. I totally agree. I loved it. Well, first of all, Katie and I have met before. And yeah. So she was in her last year of her MFA program when I came in as my first year of faculty at IU. And so it was just such an honor to see that we were going to show together. I was so excited about that. And then to learn about Eli's work. And I thought it was a very creative combination. It was like a surprise and a joy to unpack it and see how you guys were relating our works together. I just thought it was really fun. Something that I wouldn't have expected. So I loved it, yeah.
Awesome. I have another question from Deanna to all. How much of your work deals with gender and politics, or do you find some aspects of your imagery and statement connected with gender or politics besides identity?
Well, I guess I'll just, dive in. Everything I do has to do with gender and politics, I think like most of us. That's the lens through which I view the world. It's part of my research. You know, it's one of the things that is a driving force in my creative research, because it's something that I'm constantly, like gender dynamics or something I'm constantly unpacking, learning not only about myself and my own family dynamics, but also the experiences of others. As now we see gender norms although there is a long history of gender norms being challenged. I think we're at a new and exciting time when we're challenging the English language in ways that it needs to be challenged. So there's so many things, like visual culture is changing. It's being defined by more and more people, which is so exciting. And I also have to say, I think that this relates a little bit to the question that Katie received, about like how men or women appreciate the work. Like I can't tell you how many times I've actually had women, I had a woman tell me one time she was really sad for me that I was only making work for other women. And I was like, well, first of all, that's like 54% of the population. So I'm good with that. That's like a lot of people. But I actually find that oftentimes men come up to me after a lecture and they're so excited because there's space for them to talk about their bodies or their physical experiences, or the story of, caregiving for their wife while she passed away, or, caregiving for a life partner. And so I just think it's so important that, yes, like I come from a feminist and intersectional feminist perspective. My work embodies issues of gender, and that means like gender equality and equity for all people, so that there's space for all people to be seen in the conversation. And that's really critical in my mind. That's why this work is important, I think.
Thank you. Any other thoughts about that?
I don't think I specifically do any work like piece by piece that does, but I definitely try, like when I do a book or a long series, I always try to make sure that I have a large spectrum of people, races and genders and everything. So I think probably in the broader, like looking through a whole series, there would definitely be that. Mm-hmm. Same with, I don't really do anything political, but I do work that, you know, might show frustration. So sometimes that works out.
Frustration in politics, that's certainly doesn't work out quite a bit.
A lot of frustrating work the previous 4 years.
Anything else from you, Katie? Or
I think in terms of gender, sometimes I see it popping up in my studio when I focus on like colors a lot, and I'm trying to see how the color is going to be received in a piece. And I mean, that's kind of probably, I mean, the other thing I think that comes up with it is like a wearable aspect, you know. Yeah. I think we're, you know, I think maybe that's another thing that, you know, it might be difficult for, you know, some people to visualize some of these like necklaces or brooches or any type of, you know, this kind of like loud jewelry on maybe like, you know, a male body. And so maybe that, you know, isn't kind of being communicated through some of my pieces. But other than that, it doesn't really come up. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Any other questions from the audience? We'll give it just one more minute here. I just want to, you know, thank you all so much for number one, you know, submitting your proposal to exhibit at GCCA, for loaning us your beautiful work. It's such a gorgeous exhibit. It's just very distinctive to have in our gallery. This has been enlightening for me, and I'll see all the things in a new way. And I hope that the other folks that are on the call, even if they've seen it already, might come out and re-explore the work. So thank you again. I think we are good to go. You guys did great. Have a wonderful evening, everyone. Thanks to all of our folks who are viewing it now and who will view it later. Thank you to the wonderful artists for sharing your talents and your time with us. It's been a fun evening.
Thank you so much, Kim.
Cheers.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was such a pleasure.
Thank you. Likewise. Take care, everybody.